You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, and the Bloomberg Business app. Or listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome to the Thursday edition of Bloomberg Sound On. Little Friday. We're glad you're with us here as America recovers from the final Republican debate. And for that matter, Trump Town Hall before we get to Iowa. And we were watching, of course, so you didn't have to. And we'll be walking through some of the highlights and lowlights over the course of the hour here. The only thing hot, it seems, in Iowa or New Hampshire right now are the microphones. Just ask Chris Christie. You heard this as he prepared to make the big announcement that he was dropping out of the race. Not to be a spoiler, he was being honest on a mic wired up behind the scenes before he came out the podium. A lot of folks seem to have read this. Few seem to have heard it. Have you heard what Chris Christie said about Nikki Haley? Remember, the whole idea was here, he's got double digits in New Hampshire. He drops out. Those voters, 65% of them, according to the CNN UNH survey, may just jump on board Nikki Haley, and then we've got momentum in a real race. Except he doesn't actually believe that.
Yeah, I mean, look, she spent $68 million so far, just on TV. Spent $68 million so far, $59 million by DeSantis, and we spent 12. I mean, who's punching above their weight and who's getting a return on their investment, you know? And she's going to get smoked. And you and I both know it. She's not up to this.
She hasn't even.
She's going to get smoked. You and I both know it. She's not up to this. Did it matter what he said after that? That's where we start our conversation with Andrew Smith. I've been looking forward to this. And if you're a listener of this broadcast, you've heard Mr. Smith before. He is the director of the University of New Hampshire Survey Center and knows the landscape in New Hampshire as well as anyone. And as I mentioned, the CNN UNH poll that came out earlier this week made a lot of waves. And Andrew, it's great to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg Radio. I wonder what the thought was. Great to have you. The thought in New Hampshire, as Chris Christie, apparently a darling of New Hampshire, decided to drop out of the race. Did he cancel out his message with the off-mic moment?
No, I don't think so. I think it's a one-day story. It's important to remember that Chris Christie is not beloved among New Hampshire Republicans. In fact, since we've been measuring favorability ratings and some other numbers, he has by far the lowest favorability rating of any of the Republicans running in the New Hampshire primary, including Asa Hutchinson. We see that 60% of likely Republican primary voters have an unfavorable opinion of Christie. And in a poll that we did back in November and earlier polls, we're seeing 50 to 60% of New Hampshire Republican primary voters say they wouldn't vote for Christie under any circumstances. So he had a very hard ceiling on his attempts to grow his support in New Hampshire, and it really wouldn't have mattered how much money he spent. He was pretty much capped just by being the person who's been attacking Trump for so long.
Well, so it sounds like he was just looking at his own numbers and came to grips with reality. Is that fair?
I think that's a fair assessment of it. He really has no chance in any of the other early primary states, certainly not in Iowa. He's been banking his entire campaign essentially on New Hampshire, and he hasn't really gotten much of anywhere. It's also important to remember that voters in New Hampshire, despite there being campaigns are going on, are just really making up their minds right now. Exit polls have shown historically that upwards of 40 to 45% make up their minds over the final weekend of the race, and upwards of 15 to 20% make up their mind on election day. So I think he's seen that he doesn't really have an avenue in New Hampshire because of that hard ceiling of unfavorability. He certainly doesn't have any capacity of doing well in Iowa or South Carolina, the next race, or even Michigan. So he had to do well in New Hampshire or get out. And I think he read the cards and said, it's better to get out before I lose more money in this game.
So is this advantage Nikki Haley? I referenced your poll from earlier as we consider second choices. 65% of Christie supporters said that they would turn to Nikki Haley if he was not on the ballot. Is that a number you expect to see turn over?
It's kind of hard to say because, again, there's a week and a half left and we'll see what happens in Iowa. If DeSantis stays in, if DeSantis drops out, how big or not Trump's margin is in Iowa. So there's still some things to happen between now and Election Day. But if you think overall about the Republican electorate, we've had a consistently 40% or so of people in New Hampshire that have been behind Trump. And we're seeing 80 to 90% of them say they definitely decided who they're going to support. So I think Trump's got his his base there. But I don't think it's going to grow that much because people know who Trump is. They're not waiting for anything new to hear from Trump that's going to make them lean his way. So we have about 40% for Trump, about 60% who aren't necessarily for Trump. And those are the voters that all of the other Republican candidates were going after. Haley seems to have done, I think, the best job of threading the needle of not attacking Trump, and so as not to tick off the MAGA base, but also to let people know that she's the alternative to Trump. And I think that Christie dropping out, his supporters aren't necessarily big Haley supporters, but they know that they're not Trump supporters. And they're going for the person who's not Trump. And I think that right now is Haley, and that's why she's likely to pick up most of the support that Christie has.
Well, and that would be a pretty big deal if your poll has Donald Trump just single digits in the spread. She's within single digits of Trump. You add the Christie vote, he's at double digits. And we've got a real race here, Andrew.
I think so. I think that, again, it's important to remember voters in New Hampshire don't make up their minds until the end. They're really just starting to pay attention now. You've got that block of people that don't like Trump that are, and probably aren't that politically engaged, who are really starting to pay attention to this race. So she's peaking at the right time, and I think she could make it close. This has happened before. If you go back to 2008 with John McCain, who peaked at the very end of that race. Hillary Clinton coming back and peaking in New Hampshire in 2008 on the Democratic side as well. This is not an unusual sort of phenomenon. The flip side of that is Ron DeSantis a year ago was leading this race. He had 43% and Trump had 30%. He peaked way too early before the race really got engaged and before voters were paying attention.
You'll be glad to know Rick Davis, who's on our panel every day, will be following you and has some pretty interesting insights, having managed John McCain's campaign in New Hampshire. Andrew, remember the crying moment, the emotional moment that Hillary Clinton had? You're referring to her kind of last-minute turn to her benefit in New Hampshire. Does Nikki Haley, or by the way, we haven't even mentioned a guy named Ron DeSantis, do they need a moment like that? Because they're going to come flying to New Hampshire the minute the Iowa caucuses are over. And they'll have a week to make a difference, basically, to your point, with those late decision makers in New Hampshire. Does Nikki Haley need to have a human moment, have a catalyst like that that'll get people's attention?
I don't really think so. If you remember that 2008 cycle with Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, there were already only two candidates. Obama had come off of a win in Iowa, and there were only 5 days between Iowa and New Hampshire. The things that happened with Clinton were that there was that debate on Saturday night where the moderator asked her why she was unlikable and how did that make her feel, and she said it hurt her feelings. And Barack Obama said snarkily, "Well, you're likable enough, Hillary." And then she had that humanizing crying moment there, and it really galvanized support from Democratic women to say, "Oh yeah, she is being picked on again. This is sexism again in the party. Let's go for Hillary here." I don't think we have that dynamic going on this time around. It's really Trump versus the non-Trump, and I think Iowa is going to make the decision for DeSantis as to whether he's in the race or not after Iowa, because his polling numbers here in New Hampshire are declining. He's now in fourth place in New Hampshire, even behind Vivek Ramaswamy, or he's in fifth place. Excuse me, he's behind Vivek here. So he doesn't have much of an opportunity in New Hampshire, I think, to grow his support. It's been declining for a year. And if he doesn't make an extraordinary showing in Iowa, I think his campaign has to make the decision to pull the plug.
Wow. You do wonder in the next week how much of this field is going to clear out. Emerson is out with new numbers today as well, as we spend time with Andrew Smith at the University of New Hampshire. It looks in New Hampshire like this, in this poll at least, Trump 44, Haley 28, and then Christie 12. DeSantis is in single digits. How much noise is in these numbers? You've made the point several times, Andy, that people make this decision late in New Hampshire, and you've got the unpredictable nature of, 40% of voters being independent. How much stock do you put in any of these polls of the week or so out?
I've been doing polling in the New Hampshire primary for a long time, and historically polls have been wrong as often as they've been right, because voters make up their mind so late, because so many people tell us that they're going to vote, but they actually don't. Turnout is always the most difficult thing to estimate in any election, but especially in a primary election. New Hampshire, we have same-day registration. So anywhere between 10 and 15% of the electorate are people that aren't even registered, and those people are often missed by other polls who use lists of voters who've been previously registered to vote in the state. There are a number of other methodological issues that make polls quite different in the state. So I as a pollster, I would tell anybody about primary polls, use them as a very fuzzy gauge of where the election is at any time.
I hope you're going to meet up with us when we're up there. We'll meet you in Manchester, right?
I'm looking forward to it.
Excellent. This is great. Andrew Smith, he's the director of the Survey Center, University of New Hampshire. A great conversation. Thank you for the insights, Andrew. Think about this conversation that day we go to vote in New Hampshire. We'll see how much has changed in just this limited period of time as we assemble our panel. Rick Davis, the aforementioned, alongside Jeanne, Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributors. I'll start with you, Rick, since your name came up a little while ago. You've had a little bit of time to think about the impact of this Christie departure. What does it mean for Nikki Haley?
Yeah, I think it's exactly what Andrew said. The vast majority identify her as their second choice, who sit on Christie on the ballot yesterday. Remember, too, that's with Christie in the race, right? So 65% say, if something else changes, we'd be willing to go and sit on Haley's ballot. Now that he's out of the race, that number could go up. It's unlikely to go down because, the consideration is that at the time he was still in the race. So it's all upside for her. And I think definitely adds to the notion of momentum, which is even more important than polling and money right now, because New Hampshire is a momentum state. And as he said, you want to peak, next week.
Mm-hmm. That's kind of leaving us scratching our heads when it comes to the polls, right? I mean, this idea of momentum is abstract enough, Jeanne, that it's very difficult to quantify. When I look at a UNH poll that shows Trump ahead by single digits today, an Emerson poll, he's ahead by, 16 points here. USA Today, Suffolk had him up by 20. Do any of them matter?
No, I think Andrew is right. And it's, I think people should listen to him when he says many voters in New Hampshire are just now starting to pay attention. The news today about a dropout, I bet you many people in New Hampshire are focused on Bill Belichick rather than Chris Christie, to be honest.
No, that's right.
And so, the reality is that while we watch this day in and day out, for voters, they are just starting to pay attention. And I think this thing can move. That said, to imagine that it moves 20, 30 points in, when you look at some of these polls that have Trump that much ahead, that's hard to imagine, but anything can happen. So I think a lot rides on what happens in Iowa and the momentum Haley can get out of there, if any, to move her into New Hampshire. I mean, that's really her path forward.
You heard the hot mic remarks at the beginning of our conversation here. Here's what he actually said on the microphone a few minutes later.
Because I want to promise you this. I am going to make sure that in no way do I enable Donald Trump to ever be president of the United States again. And that's more important than my own personal ambition.
Okay, that's great. But Rick, he says she's going to get smoked. Which one does he believe?
He's a politician. He doesn't believe anything. He does what the pollsters tell him to do. No, that's a very cynical view, but it's not too far off the mark.
Well, look,
he's a lifelong Paul. I mean, what he says in public and what he thinks in private, even off of a hot mic, you can't trust any of it. It's obviously not in his interest to have Donald Trump president again, because I have no doubt that if Donald Trump's president, he will find some way to go after legally Chris Christie. So it's in his personal self-interest, professional self-interest, to see somebody else win. If he's cynical enough to get out of the race one day and hope it helps her and say at the same time, she's a loser. Yeah, that's just who he is. There's a reason he's got so many negatives, I guess.
Well, I'll tell you what, Trump on Fox News last night says he's liking Chris Christie already a lot more. We'll walk you through the debate in the town hall next with Rick and Jeanne. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch the program live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg Radio, the TuneIn app, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
We were watching, so you didn't have to, the split screen night. Did you see either of them, the final Republican debate or the Trump town hall. He skipped them all, including last night, the last debate before Iowa, to go on Fox News this time, of counter-programming the whole thing, which you might suggest was a pretty good strategy after what we saw last evening on the stage on CNN. Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, boy, not fans of each other, going for broke here, spending the first hour beating each other up, the second hour going after Donald Trump. And Nikki Haley did go there on the 2020 election, said it out loud.
That election, Trump lost it. Biden won that election. And the idea that he's gone and carried this out forever to the point that he's going to continue to say these things to scare the American people are wrong.
So reassemble our panel. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino come along. Bloomberg politics contributors. I'm sure you were both up late going through the highlights and the lowlights here. Why don't we start with the debate, then we can move to Donald Trump's escapade last evening. Jeanne, Nikki Haley had an important moment there. I don't know what the ratings look like or how many people may or may not have been influenced, but to actually share the stage with Ron DeSantis and go at it, that was probably the chippiest debate that we have seen yet in the cycle. Did it make any difference?
No, the words that kept coming to my mind were really aggravating. I mean, they both did fine. All they did was fight with each other. I did the split screen thing, and you had Trump there basically on an infomercial, very subdued, very calm. And then you had those two going at each other. You played that clip from Nikki Haley. She didn't really get to the criticism of the faraway frontrunner until the second half of the debate.
That's right.
And, I don't know what you guys found, but like this idea, liar, liar, pants on fire, DeSantisLies.com, anybody under the age of 50, I felt like it was like retro because nobody looks at websites like that anymore. That was like in 2008 when Obama was running and we were all applauding that they had a website for their campaign. She didn't do anything really groundbreaking. She kept repeating that. And of course, Ron DeSantis was fine, but I don't think he made any headway. So I just thought the winner here was Donald Trump, as it has been throughout all of these debates.
Well, I'll ask you both about Trump's performance here. How about Ron DeSantis last night, Rick? It was interesting watching him go through the motions one-on-one. That's not something that we've had a chance to witness yet. Very rehearsed in a lot of cases, going for the money line, trying to get the applause line and so forth. He even fell into his remarks, apparently kind of had a brainwave and thought he was debating Gavin Newsom at one point as he called her the governor of California. Listen to this back and forth.
In the state of Florida, we're ranked number one for economy of all 50 states by CNBC, number one
highest
for education.
Cost of living.
She was ranked number 50 in education when she was governor of California.
Insurance.
Well, I think that was actually from his prep from the Gavin Newsom debate on Fox. Rick, how did he do?
Yeah, look, I mean, it was really rehearsed, right? I mean, I think the easiest night were the moderators, Jake Tapper, and they just stood back and let these guys go at it, and it was really all just talking points. I mean, I don't think I've ever heard a debate where the word liar was used in every single sentence, and it got a little exhausting. I mean, I kind of give tropes to Donald Trump because at least he only had an hour town hall and you didn't have to suffer through another 60 minutes. I mean, 120 minutes of that stuff was more than any voter in any state will ever want to watch. So you're right. No telling who watched, how they were impacted by that. They didn't distinguish themselves poorly. They look like professional politicians, beating each other up. I don't know how that helps either one of them in Iowa. And, I'm not exactly sure how any of that helps Nikki Haley in New Hampshire, since that's her top focus. But the bottom line is I agree with Jeanne, good night for Donald Trump.
So it was a tree that fell in the political woods on CNN. On Fox, and I'm assuming that a lot more Republicans saw that. Rick, to your point, that would be the viewing habit. It was an attempt at normalization, at least in my view. Lines like, I'm not going to have time for retribution, or this one on the dictator. Here's Trump.
I said, I'm going to be a dictator for one day. We're going to do two things. The border, we're going to make it so tight you can't get in unless you come in legally. And the other is energy. We're going to drill, baby, drill. After that, I'm not going to be a dictator. After that, I'm not going to be a dictator. So
that's what had been said.
So you weren't saying that the press picks it up. So I said, I'm going to be a dictator for one day. They cut it. They go, I'm going to be a dictator. But they cut the rest of the sentence. No, I am not going to be a dictator. I'm going to manage like we did. We were so successful.
I am not going to be a dictator, Rick. Interesting here, as Donald Trump is apparently listening to his advisors.
Yeah, my guess is they pulled that, and it was not a pretty picture to voters, regardless of whether it's one day or, every day of your presidency. American voters don't want a dictator at all. And so walking that back the way he did, I'm not exactly sure it was very convincing. First of all, he said, yeah, I'm definitely going to be a dictator for the first day. But then again, I'm not going to be a dictator. And he blames the media, which, by the way, to most Fox viewers, they don't consider Fox the media. They consider that the truth teller. And, maybe that works for the crowd that was tuned in. But what a cakewalk for Donald Trump. I mean, the people asking questions, each one started out with how great Donald Trump is. And by the way, I'm almost embarrassed I have to ask you a question, but here you go.
Well, you know what issue they did get into? Really interesting, Jeanne. This is a recurring theme this week. And it's a theme that started here at Bloomberg, I dare say, because the idea of being afraid to talk about entitlements has been a big concern here in Washington, as we nibble around the edges of the budget. And our interview with Nikki Haley has been coming back again and again and again, and her stand on potentially raising the retirement age was referenced in both of those shows last night. It came up by Ron DeSantis in the debate, and Donald Trump brought it up in the Fox town hall. Let's listen to what he said.
DeSantis wants to cut Social Security and Medicare. Nikki Haley wants to cut Social Security and Medicare. Nikki Haley wanted to raise the age from 65 to 74, 75.
So where did that come from? That was from our interview with Nikki Haley on the 24th of August, to the point now where not only was Donald Trump ready for that line of attack last night, Rick and Jeanne, but it has apparently been put into an official ad, a Trump campaign ad that dropped this morning in New Hampshire. Here he is.
To secure retirement, Nikki Haley's plan ends that.
Social Security, Medicare, how would you manage the entitlements?
Oh, boy.
We say the rules have changed.
Okay, so that's from our interview here on Bloomberg. Jeanne, does that mean that this, in fact, will be a major issue on the campaign trail? We're going to forget about it after the primaries.
Whose voice did we just hear on that ad? Was that you, Joe?
Yeah, I'm afraid.
I'm glad to hear that Trump and his team and everybody is listening. And it's a really important issue. And we heard it, to your point, in the town hall. We heard it in the debate. There was an extended discussion by DeSantis and Nikki Haley arguing back and forth about the very issue that you asked her about way back in August. And now they have her on tape. And, economically, she is probably right to raise this. We do have an enormous problem, but everybody from DeSantis to Trump to Biden knows politically it's a loser. And so that's why they keep bringing it up. And of course, I think we will hear Joe Biden bring it up as well, if potentially, and it's a big if, you were to see somebody like Nikki Haley win the nomination. I mean, this is Rick Scott all over again, and they are just waiting to vote on her for it.
Rick Scott all over again, Rick Davis, makes me think that this will not be an issue on the campaign trail when this goes to the general.
Yeah, you could just tell that that Nikki Haley really tried to walk it back, conditioning the comments she made to you in that interview. My guess is we're going to see you in other campaign commercials besides just Donald Trump's before the end of this. But that's only if Nikki has any life after New Hampshire. So let's hold our breath and hope that Joe becomes an issue in the general election campaign.
God forbid. We don't want to become the story. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, great analysis. And they're going to be back with us after we tackle some issues with Jared Berstein. I've been looking forward to this conversation as well, because we've got important news today that I haven't even gotten around to yet, and that's consumer prices. You've been hearing about it throughout the day on Bloomberg. CPI day, with data showing inflation up more than expected. And we want the view from the White House, as always, and a chance to spend some time with Jared Berstein, of course, chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. He's with us, as you can see on YouTube, from the White House North Lawn. Mr. Chairman, it's great to see you. Before I ask you about CPI, I wonder your thoughts on this conversation about the retirement age, about managing, potentially reforming entitlements, Social Security and Medicare. Is that something that the administration plans to weigh into?
I think we already have, in the sense that our budget continuously extends the solvency, Medicare, Social Security. These are critical programs that this president has not only pledged to protect, but has continuously provided proposals to do so. Now, look, I mean, one way to do this is to continue to pursue his fair taxation agenda. Not a dime of higher taxes under 400,000 AGI, but he has a robust agenda to enforce fair taxation. Part of that, by the way, is blocking people from millionaires and billionaires from evading taxes by making sure that the IRS is adequately funded. And what have the Republicans done? They've actively worked against that funding, tried to cut it, and in fact have extracted reductions there in some of these budget deals. That's basically a shadow tax cut for tax evaders, and that's not okay for wealthy tax evaders, and that's not okay with this president.
At some point, though, the retirement age is going to have to be lifted, Jared, isn't it? We're living longer. It's just a different world now.
Look, Social Security is such an essentially important program for our seniors, and it is one of the most effective, efficient programs we have. We're going to continue to protect it, to bolster it, and to make sure it is there for generations to come.
Maybe you'll end up in a Trump ad as well, Jared. I wonder. On this CPI day, how are you feeling? I'm looking at the headlines here. U.S. inflation accelerates, tempering case for Fed to cut rates. U.S. inflation picks up as goods prices halt months-long decline. I could keep going here. Is the moral of the story that this matter of inflation, the trajectory, does not in fact move in a straight line? Because we were talking about Goldilocks a couple of weeks ago. Jared, how do we decipher this one?
Yeah, that's exactly the right way to tee that up. Any month can bump one way or the other. And I know, Joe, I've emphasized this in our discussions. We at the Council of Economic Advisors make a point out of never overemphasizing a particular month. And in fact, by the way, if you look at the pace of a headline CPI inflation over the past 3 months annualized, it's still 1.8%. And that's because the last 3 months were 0.1.3. So do the math, and you get that kind of underlying trend remains the friend of those who want to see inflation continue to come down. You mentioned goods prices. I think the unsnarling supply chains is very much baked in the cake, and we saw goods prices continue to be very low. So look, I mean, core inflation, very important to the Fed. Core inflation, of course, hit expectations. 0.3 was expected, 0.3 was delivered. So we see that prices continuing to ease, job market remaining strong, and the combination of those two is delivering real wage gains, which we also learned about this morning. And that's a trend, not a blip. We've seen real wages up about 1% over the past year, and they've been rising now for a while. Very important to our working families.
Well, we've talked before as well, Jared, about the last mile, that it's in fact, it's that last 10 pounds that are so hard to lose here. Are we going into the most difficult part of this inflation battle?
I mean, I think we'll have to see. I certainly understand those arguments. I mean, one question there is there more room to run on the economy supply side? Can we continue to improve supply chains, and can we continue to see labor supply increase, especially among prime age workers? And I think the answer to both of those is yes. So I'm not ready to sign up for this last mile argument, though it's something we're of course going to be keeping a close eye on.
Okay. That's fascinating. Do you worry about the impact of what's going on the Red Sea? Jared, you've referred to supply chains and goods prices here, and we're looking at these massive tankers going all the way around Africa because of this security threat at the moment. Is that going to reach consumers at some point?
Again, this is something that, whether it's our national security, our economic team, monitoring extremely closely. Operation Prosperity, as you know, is a coalition effort in effect to help escort ships and keep commerce going in the region. Now, I think the important thing there is to just cut right to the punchline and look at the impact on gas prices, at least thus far. It's been a very limited impact. I woke up this morning and the national gas price was $3.08 a gallon. It was below $3 in 30 states across the land. And remember, in June of 22, that price peaked at north of $5 a gallon. So that's been very welcome to American consumers at the pump. It's also helping to keep consumer spending strong, and that's been at the core of our recovery. So limited impact thus far, but very much, of course, on the watch list.
I'm spending time with Jared Berstein, chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors here on Bloomberg. I'm sure you're dialed in on this potential for a tax deal on Capitol Hill, Jared. I'm kind of amazed that we're even having this conversation right now when we're not even sure if we can fund the government or, dealing with the border or so many other issues that we could talk about. But apparently we are on the verge of a deal between the Democratic-led Senate and the Republican-led House that would restore the enhanced child tax credit in exchange for more friendly business taxes. I wonder if the White House is in favor of this, if you have a sense of the contours of what the economic impact of that might look like.
Well, I think it's a really important practice not to for the White House to comment until the president goes first when it comes to ongoing negotiations. So I'm not going to give you a White House readout. What I will say is that President Biden has consistently supported a child tax credit expansion, much like the one he put in place in the rescue plan. Now, he's talked about the importance of paying for that. And again, that takes us back to a tax agenda that injects a significant fairness into the code, particularly for those at the top of the scale and particularly for those who want to evade taxes by giving the IRS the resources it needs. But look, the child tax credit reduced child poverty in half, and then it expired, and child poverty went way back up. It is one of the greatest investments we can make in this nation to have as low a child poverty rate as possible. And what we learned from earlier versions of that debate, the numbers I just cited, is that the child poverty rate is a policy decision. And our decision is to try to keep that as low as possible, and that certainly connects to a robust CTC.
Well, there was a lot of concern about the expiration, of course, the child tax credit. We talked a lot about as well the expansion of COVID-era funding for child care programs, the child care cliff, they called it. We went over that cliff, Jared, and I wonder if the landing has not been as hard, forgive me if I'm using the wrong expression here, as some had feared.
Well, maybe I would probably hone the expression a little in the following way. Just the way that was constructed, it was more of a phase down than a cliff. But look, the bottom line is still relevant. We really want to make sure that anyone who wants to join this labor market and work the desired number of hours and weeks they want ought to be able to do so. And especially for caretakers who are, of course, disproportionately women, that means adequate access to affordable child care. I would call this, in fact, President Biden would call this one of our more important pieces of unfinished business as we go forward. Again, we have robust proposals in our budget, fully paid for, to expand access to affordable child care. And it's not just an important micro issue for people at the kitchen table, which is what this president cares so much about. It's also helpful to the macro economy by boosting labor supply.
Well, this is remarkably happening at the same time, as I mentioned. We talk about government funding. Next Friday would be the beginning of a shutdown if this doesn't work out. And I know that Speaker Johnson is under immense pressure from his right flank in the House to not do a continuing resolution. Jared, I'm just wondering if you see the odds of a shutdown rising and what economic impact that would have.
I think it's really hard to put odds on these things, but I think the people who watch it closely took those odds pretty far down when it looked like there was, if not an agreement, a proposal from Speaker Johnson on the top lines for the appropriation bills. Let me put it this way. Again, these are ongoing negotiations that I don't want to lean into from this particular podium. But what I will say is this. You and I have just had a good, robust discussion of all the things that are going right in the U.S. economy. Low unemployment, inflation easing, real wage gains, actual cost reductions in key areas of consumer spending, whether it's gas, milk, bread, eggs, airfares, TVs, and so on. The idea that we would want to kick the ball in our own goal with an unnecessary government shutdown when I think majorities on both sides want to avoid that is absolutely counterindicated right now. So I just am urging anyone who is in those negotiations to avoid that possibility.
It's like a recurring nightmare, Jared. It's always a good and robust conversation with the chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, Jared Berstein. Great to see you, sir. Thanks for joining, as always.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, and the Bloomberg Business app. Or listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome to Hour 2 of Bloomberg Sound On. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz. How many days to Iowa? 5?
4.
4? And we've got 9 days to a possible shutdown. I'm still really compelled by how all of these are going to smash together over the next week. Iowa shut down New Hampshire, or is it Iowa motion to vacate New Hampshire?
Good question.
We're going to be in early states while some wild stuff is going on here in Washington.
Wild indeed. I mean, it's already happening. It's
That's
already
true.
wild. It could potentially get more wild as we get closer and closer to a deadline. That is what tends to happen.
Right.
The clock starts ticking louder and faster. But if you're Mike Johnson right now, probably figuring out how you can fund the government and keep your job. Or is that simply not possible? These are two binary outcomes.
Or is your name just still Kevin? Because that's what it feels like. We'll talk more about that with Kyle ahead, because you might have seen Chuck Schumer is not waiting around. He's starting the cloture process on a CR today. So we'll talk a little more about potentially being jammed by the Senate as we all try to recover from our debate hangover. Was that an exercise in futility? I don't know if we've seen ratings yet, but I just don't feel like that moved the needle for a lot of people.
Well, we heard a lot of what we had already heard from Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis to a large part, at least when it comes to contrasting them with the current frontrunner, Donald Trump. I think the question is, did one of them succeed in getting farther ahead of the other? If not getting closer to Trump, did one gain and one lose? I don't know that we have
Nikki
a sense
Haley's
of that
waiting
yet.
around for all the Christie voters to show up for her. So it might have just been a wash of a night. Kyle Kondik joins us from Sabato's Crystal Ball at Kailey's alma mater, the University of Virginia. Kyle, it's great to see you. I'm sorry if you had to endure all of that as well. I'm sure you did. Did it make a difference?
Probably not. That we've been waiting for some post New Year's Day more Iowa polling, and there's been a couple came out today. Suffolk and then Iowa State just dropped one a few minutes ago, and Trump's over 50 in both of them, and Haley and DeSantis are close to each other, but very far behind Trump, in the 15 to 20% range. I think they were tied at 14 in the Iowa State poll. So, I mean, maybe we're in for some sort of huge surprise here on Monday night, but, all of the indicators are that we have so far is that Trump is going to win this thing going away.
Well, Kyle, do we need to redefine what surprise actually means when it comes to Iowa? Because sure, it would be absolutely astounding if Trump didn't win, but could the surprise actually be in the margin? How close to him is enough that even second place feels like massive news?
So the Trump campaign has noted accurately that of all the contested non-incumbent Republican Iowa caucuses over history, the biggest margin of victory is 12 points. And so they're sort of setting the bar like, hey, we win by more than 12 points. That's good. I personally don't, if they win by like 13 or 14, I don't think that that's some sort of impressive performance given what the polls are showing now, which is more like he's up by like 30 points. What is the difference between a good performance and a bad one? I don't know. Maybe that's like 40% or something like that, which actually, given the polls, he's consistently been over 40% would seem maybe not that great. So there is, there's maybe a higher bar for Trump to impress in Iowa, but if he matches the polls, he will have done that. I also think it's probably fair to treat Trump differently than you would in a normal non-incumbent race, because he is sort of like a quasi-incumbent, given that he's he's aiming for a third straight Republican presidential nomination and has already served the term as president before. So I don't know where I'd put the number necessarily, but just matching or slightly exceeding that historical 12-point margin, that probably is not good enough to be impressive. And in fact, I think would probably be disappointing if it's close to that number, again, given what the polls say.
Well, of course, everyone's banking on a surprise in New Hampshire because it's New Hampshire. Of course, it's not a surprise if you're expecting it. But after Chris Christie dropped out of the race, Kyle, I wonder your thoughts on the impact it could have on Nikki Haley. We've seen polls that show Donald Trump and Haley within single digits. This would make up the difference there. But we also heard from Christie himself, hot mic, she's not up for this. She's going to get smoked. Which Christie's right?
Look, I would not be surprised by Haley winning in New Hampshire. I think she frankly needs to win New Hampshire to really to really justify staying in the contest, frankly. Her home state of South Carolina votes like a month after New Hampshire. And so you kind of enter like a little bit of a dead period. There are contests in Nevada in early February, but there's a caucus that's actually awarding the delegates that Donald Trump's probably going to win easily. And then there's like a beauty contest primary that Haley's competing, and she's not competing for the delegates, which she'll probably win comfortably. I don't know what you really do with that. So after New Hampshire, the focus will really go to South Carolina. But again, Haley, the coalition Haley is building is kind of centered on more moderate voters. A lot of independents can cross over and vote in the New Hampshire primary, and probably will, and are probably inclined to support a candidate like her, particularly with Chris Christie out of the race. If Haley can't win there, and let's say Trump wins Iowa and New Hampshire, I don't know if there's much of a rationale for anyone else to even continue, given that, I guess at that point, the only real threat to Trump would be some of these legal matters he's dealing with, but he would have basically stopped DeSantis in Iowa and stopped Haley in New Hampshire. But again, I could definitely see Haley winning New Hampshire, but that's not enough to make this thing a real horse race. I think Trump would have to lose South Carolina too in order for we just to go into Super Tuesday and say, hey, this thing has really opened up.
Well, Kyle, doesn't it matter who else is in the race at that point? Do you think we could see a further thinning of the field between Iowa and New Hampshire? If Ron DeSantis can't actually get number 2 in Iowa, do you think that means he's out?
It could. I mean, it's a decision. It's up to him. Although you have to look at like whether he would have the resources to continue, et cetera. But he's banked everything on Iowa, and I think his polling has suffered certainly in New Hampshire. If he can't finish ahead of Haley in Iowa, he's certainly not going to finish ahead of her in New Hampshire. So I think it could potentially be curtains for DeSantis if Iowa doesn't turn out in some sort of positive kind of way for him.
What do you make of this? I don't mean to sneak up on you with it, Kyle. This no labels news that we're hearing about just in the last hour here. Larry Hogan is stepping down from the no labels board in what some see as maybe the best indication yet that he too plans to run. No Labels itself, separately being reported, is in touch with allies of Chris Christie. Is this just noise, or are we going to have a third-party candidate?
I find that difficult to handicap. I actually had not heard about the Hogan news until you just mentioned it. He would be sort of the logical person to run. And, look, I think from the Democrats' perspective, a Chris Christie or a Larry Hogan heading the no labels ticket, I mean, that's probably worse news for Joe Biden than it is for Donald Trump, because they have appealed to the kind of like lapsed Republican voters that may more naturally be Biden voters as opposed to Trump voters in a head-to-head matchup. So, I think it's also possible that no labels just sputters out and doesn't run anyone. But that's one of the many wild cards. It's interesting that like the primary season is not that exciting, but there's a whole lot of other stuff about this 2024 election that is exciting and interesting, and the potential roster of third-party candidates is part of that, which is again still up in the air. And these candidates would have to get ballot access, or no labels is trying to get ballot access for their person if they run someone. So that's one of the moving pieces here.
Well, there's also moving pieces in the background, Kyle. Joe and I were just discussing it here in Washington. We're in this big showdown over spending. We're facing down a potential government shutdown with the knowledge that the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, has a very close relationship with the former president. And I'm conscious that I may be overthinking it here, considering I, from where I sit, pay very close attention to the 2024 race and to Congress when not everyone else does. But could Trump be damaged if there is a government shutdown and it's perceived as him having some influence on that? Because this could be happening while people are making choices in primaries.
I doubt it in the short term. I mean, look, if we have like an entire year of chaos in the House, and maybe you have like a government shutdown in late summer or in the fall, which I doubt Republicans would allow to happen. But I mean, who knows? The Republican conference in the House just seems basically ungovernable. So I don't think that this stuff matters in terms of the actual 2024 presidential election. I mean, look, we have, the presidential candidates, who the nominees are, they end up becoming basically the leaders of their respective parties. I think that a lot of the election results kind of flow from what happens in the presidential race. And so I don't think that the chaos in the House is all that meaningful. It's certainly meaningful for the operation of the country, though. And I guess, see why the markets would care about it. And why people who follow this stuff closely would care about it. But in terms of political impact, I'd say probably not much, at least in the short term.
You wonder to what extent Donald Trump has his thumb on the scale in the House, though, Kyle, with the speaker talking to him on the regular. You talked to him and Joe Biden apparently yesterday alone. And we're hearing some pretty loud noise from the Freedom Caucus here. And you wonder to what extent the discord is being fed by the former president.
It's quite possible. I mean, the former president demands total loyalty, but he doesn't necessarily give it back in return. He's been sort of a chaos agent in the past in terms of his dealings with Republican, with his fellow party members in the House and the Senate. I doubt that the former president is being a constructive player in trying to resolve these things, and quite possibly the opposite.
Finally, Kyle, we only have about 45 seconds left, but would a shutdown make it change the odds of how many seats may flip in terms of the House majority come November? Because we got to consider the down ballot here too.
Again, in the short term, I don't really think so. But again, it's quite possible that you'd have this sort of volatility continuing throughout the year. And I would think that would probably help Democrats on the margins. But again, I think we're still far away from that potentially being important. There's such a churn of news and stuff that I just think these things can be easily forgotten, even though I don't want to downplay, they actually have clear real world importance. I just don't necessarily know if they're going to be dictating election outcomes, here in January, looking ahead to November.
Well, Kyle, it's good to see you. Kyle Kondik at Sabato's Crystal Ball, where he's managing editor at the University of Virginia Center for Politics. We thank you, as always, Kyle. Stay in touch. We'd like to talk to you once we get some actual voting to discuss. It is kind of crazy to think about that on Monday. It won't be a poll. It'll be real.
Real numbers, 4 days away.
Yeah, and we'll be there for it. The weather is another matter. We'll talk about that later this hour, too, because that'll be another point of history in Iowa. With Kailey Leinz, I'm Joe Mathieu. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, and the Bloomberg Business app. Or listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts.
Yeah, it's become a habit now, a daily thing where I'm watching the local newscast, the local weathercast specifically. But it's the local stations in Des Moines that have really attracted my attention. And for them, even for them, this is going to be really bad. We've talked about the cold.
Yeah.
But it's getting colder.
I don't even know if we can describe this as cold. It seems like an inadequate description for temperatures of negative 20 and wind chills of negative 30 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, mind you.
Yes. Biblical. A Wall Street Journal reporter tweets, Nikki Haley talking about the weather today, quote, "It's going to be so cold, I don't even know what negative 15 is. I was complaining when it was cold in Iowa in October." Are you ready for the latest?
Oof.
KCCI, Channel 8, Des Moines.
Snowfall amount 6 to 9 inches over parts of western and northern Iowa, 9 to 12 inches for places like Fort Dodge over toward Humboldt, Iowa Falls, down toward Ames and Marshalltown, 6 to 9 inches in the metro. We're going to be on that cusp there, though, where we can see some higher amounts.
Tomorrow.
And then the bitter cold settles in coming up on Saturday
Bitter
with
cold.
Listen to
snow
this.
flurries. It's possible by Saturday evening we drop below zero, and we stay below zero for air temperatures all the way into Tuesday afternoon.
The whole time we're there.
Literally.
So it's going to be below zero tomorrow, I guess, by the time we get there Saturday, and it'll stay there for the duration. How are we going to get there, though? There's another snowstorm tomorrow.
I don't know. Cross your fingers, Joe. Bundle up.
You mentioned something about hypothermia.
Yeah. Apparently, if we're outside for longer than 10 minutes.
This is for caucus goers as well.
Exposed.
Yeah.
That's when hypothermia could set in.
So
if
we
you are
have
not
10
adequately
minutes.
prepared.
Okay.
Yeah, so run.
That's
basically.
Nothing. We'll just
when
not
you're
spend
outside.
much time outside.
Yeah.
We'll let you know how awful it looks tomorrow, I guess, because this could impact turnout. It's not just about Joe and Kailey.
Thanks for listening to the Sound On podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at 1 p.m. Eastern Time at Bloomberg.com.